Help.
Are you okay?
The rancher took her in without questions, until she whispered the one name he never expected to hear. January 1887. A winter storm tore across the frontier highlands, rain slashing sideways like thrown gravel, thunder cracking open the blackened sky. Wind lashed the pines that ringed a solitary ranch house perched on the lonely plateau, making the old timbers groan as if the land itself were warning travelers away. Inside the log house, Colt Remington sat alone beside a hearth gone cold. No fire burned there anymore. It had been years since he allowed one to last through the night. The faint glow of dying embers reflected off his weathered face, hard lines etched deep by war and grief. He had once been a cavalry officer, respected and decorated, a man who believed in orders and brotherhood. That man had vanished the night his younger brother, Asher Remington, was killed in a failed ambush. Colt was certain had not been chance. Since then, Colt had withdrawn from the world. He trusted no one. He kept his doors closed, his lanterns dark, and his memories buried where they could not bleed him dry. The knock came suddenly. 3 raps against the door. Light, but desperate. Colt's body went still. His hand closed around the grip of the revolver at his hip. No one ever came here. Not in daylight. Certainly not in a storm like this. He waited, listening past the thunder, until the sound came again. 3 knocks, uneven now, as if the hand making them were failing. Slowly, Colt rose and crossed the room. He opened the door with the gun hidden behind his leg. A woman stood on his porch. She was drenched to the bone, dark hair plastered to her face, rain streaming down her hollowed cheeks. Her eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, her lips blue from cold. Blood seeped through the torn fabric at her shoulder. In both arms, she clutched a small canvas satchel, holding it tight against her chest as though letting go would finish her. "Help," she whispered, voice barely carrying over the storm. Then her knees buckled, and she collapsed forward. Colt caught her just in time. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, rain soaking into his sleeves, the weight of a stranger in his arms. She could be trouble, she could be bait. She could be the very thing he had spent 6 years avoiding. But instinct, older than fear, took over. He carried her inside and laid her gently on the bench near the hearth. Her skin was icy. He stripped off her soaked coat, revealing the wound in her shoulder, crude and hastily bound. Working in silence, Colt cleaned and wrapped it as best he could. The woman never woke, but even unconscious, her fingers remained locked around the satchel. He did not pry it from her. Instead, he pulled a dry blanket over her, removed her wet boots, and stood for a long moment watching her shallow breaths fog the air. Then, from a shelf long untouched, he took down the storm lantern, the only one he had kept when he extinguished all the others. It had been Asher's. A foolish gift, once, given with a grin and a promise to always come home. Colt lit it. The soft amber glow filled the room, chasing back shadows he had lived with for years. He set the lantern on the table beside her and said nothing. The storm raged on through the night. Near midnight, the woman stirred. Her brow tightened, her body twitching as if caught in unseen hands. She whispered in her sleep, broken phrases spilling out between shallow breaths. "Do not trust them." A pause, a shudder. Asher said not to. Tears slid from the corners of her eyes. Colt leaned closer, heart hammering in his chest. "Asher?" he murmured. But she slipped back into uneasy stillness, leaving only the rain and the lantern's low hiss to answer him. By morning, the storm had weakened into a cold, steady drizzle. Colt stood at the stove, stirring a pot of thin soup, when he heard movement behind him. The woman was awake. She sat up slowly, eyes darting around the room, one hand immediately finding the satchel at her side. Her gaze landed on Colt, wary and guarded. He turned, studying her carefully. "What's your name?" he asked. She did not answer at once. Her fingers tightened on the bag. She swallowed, as if weighing every word against danger. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and strained. "I need to find someone," she said. Then, barely above a whisper, "Asher Remington." The spoon slipped from Colt's hand and clattered against the stove. For a moment, the world narrowed to that single name, the one he had tried to bury, the one that still cut him open every night. Colt stood frozen, staring at the woman who had brought his past to his doorstep. The door he had sealed for years had been knocked open at last. The tin spoon struck the basin with a loud clang. "Where did you hear that name?" Colt snapped, his voice suddenly sharp enough to cut stone. The woman flinched. She sat up straighter, still pale, still clutching the canvas satchel to her side. Her lips parted, but no answer came. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, as if weighing whether she was still in danger. Then, slowly, she reached inside the satchel and pulled out a folded bundle of paper. Hands trembling, she extended it toward him. He didn't take it immediately. The storm outside had become a whisper compared to the thunder building inside him. "What is this?" he asked, voice lower now, more dangerous. "My name is Margot Ellis," she said quietly. "This belonged to Asher." Colt's breath caught. She placed the papers on the table between them. At the top of the stack were several weathered letters, the paper yellowed and soft at the corners. But one stood out, a sealed envelope, edges fraying, addressed in a familiar hand. "For Colt Remington, if I don't make it." Colt stared at it, unmoving. That handwriting. Asher's. He could never forget it. They had shared letters through half a dozen outposts, through half a dozen wars. But this envelope, this had never reached him. Until now. He picked it up like it might explode in his hands. The silence between them stretched thick. Margot broke it first, her voice brittle. "He gave that to me. 3 days before he died. He told me to keep it hidden. Said he couldn't trust anyone else." Colt narrowed his eyes. "Why you?" Margot hesitated. "I was a field nurse. He came in with a minor wound, a busted shoulder, stayed for 3 days. We talked, mostly about meaningless things. But the night before he left, he said something was wrong. Said he thought someone up the chain was feeding information to the other side, someone with access to classified routes and troop movements." Colt's eyes didn't leave her. He said, "If anything happened to him, I needed to find you," she continued. "That you'd know how to read what he left behind." "He said that?" Colt's voice was dry, almost a whisper. She nodded. "I didn't understand it all, not then. But when he died, when they said it was a random skirmish, I knew something was wrong. And you've been running ever since?" She gave a bitter laugh. "You can't know something like that and not be hunted. I didn't even open the letter. I just held on to it. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't even know if you were alive." Colt opened the letter slowly, every fiber in his body tense. Inside were 3 pages. He read in silence, his eyes scanning quickly, and then again, slower. His jaw tightened. The codes, the phrases, the signature at the bottom, all of it was Asher, and the last line stopped him cold. "Only Colt will know what this means. It's the same code we made when we were kids, in the old barn behind Pa's place." He sat down heavily in the chair. Everything in him rebelled against it, against hope, against grief that might come roaring back. But facts were facts. She wasn't lying, or she was a damn good actor. And this was something too deep, too personal, too impossible to fake. Still, he didn't let her see the shift inside him. Instead, he folded the letter, placed it back on the table, and stood. "You can stay," he said gruffly. "For now, until I figure out what the hell this all means." Margot let out a breath, quiet but heavy. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just nodded, as though she knew this was the best she could ask for, and maybe all she needed. Outside, the storm had finally passed. But inside the house, another one had just begun. Colt let her stay. Not because he trusted her, not because of the name she whispered, but because something in her eyes the night she collapsed, something unspoken, had lodged in his chest and refused to leave. Still, their silence weighed heavier than the snow on the porch roof. He laid down rules like lines in the sand. Don't touch the rifle. Don't go upstairs. Stay out of the barn after dark. The words were sharp, cold, not shouted, just final, as if he'd spoken them 1,000 times to no one but himself. Margot only nodded, eyes steady. No protest, no questions. He watched her. Not directly, never directly, but always. Every night, after the house grew quiet and Margot had retreated to the small bed by the kitchen hearth, Colt unlatched the old wooden trunk he kept beneath the stairs. Inside were fragments of another life, dusty files, military dispatches, letters from a brother long buried. He scanned Asher's old handwriting, compared it to the letter Margot had brought. Matched phrases, cross-checked names. Every word she said, he tested against memory. Each time something aligned, his jaw clenched, not from relief, but fear. Fear that believing might break him worse than the betrayal ever had. Margot never asked to leave. She swept the floors, mended his coat with a thread kit she'd kept in her satchel, fed the fire, cooked quiet, steady meals. She kept to herself, guarding that canvas bag like it was her last breath. And every evening, she fed the horses, without ever being told. One morning, the crunch of her boots on frozen earth caught his ear. He watched from the barn door as she hoisted a bucket of water from the well, her left arm trembling from the strain. She staggered halfway to the trough before her injured shoulder gave way. She fell to her knees. The water spilled across the frost-bitten dirt. Colt stepped out of the shadows. Without a word, he hauled her to her feet, took the bucket, refilled it, and carried it to the trough himself. The horses drank as he stood silent, eyes on the steam rising from the water. Then he turned back to her, voice gruff. "Next time, ask. You're no use dead, Miss Ellis." She opened her mouth, maybe to thank him, maybe to argue, but he was already walking away. That night, Margot lay in bed, her shoulder aching. She did not expect anything. But when she woke at dawn, there was a small pouch on the table beside her pillow. Inside were dried herbs, the kind soldiers used to fight infection. Next to it, a scrap of paper, hastily written. "Boil and apply to your shoulder, twice a day. See." She stared at the note, fingers curling around its edges. No smile crossed her lips. But something in her expression shifted, softened. A silent breath of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Safety, maybe, or the beginning of it. She didn't speak of it. The next night, a bitter wind swept through the valley. Colt was still outside, cleaning his rifle beneath a lantern. Margot placed a mug of hot tea on the step outside his door, then went to bed. No note? No comment? The next morning, the mug was empty, cleaned, returned to where it had been. They never mentioned it. Then came Emma. A freckled child from a ranch a mile off. 8 years old, curious as a squirrel. She adored Margot from the first moment, and began visiting weekly, brightening the quiet house with laughter and endless questions. She named Margot Miss Star Lady, after the stories she told, about stars being the eyes of those watching over us from beyond. Colt would glance through the window and see Emma wrapped around Margot's legs, giggling. See Margot smile, eyes crinkling like someone remembering how. One evening, Colt stood with her in the stable, brushing down his mare. He didn't mean to speak. But the question left him before he could stop it. "Why'd you run?" Margot didn't turn. She watched the mare's nose dip into the hay and said, quietly, "Because someone died for what I know, and I wasn't ready to die yet." No tears, no trembling, just fact, laid bare in the cool breath of night. Colt didn't move. He looked at her, this stranger with shadows in her voice and stars in her stories, and for the first time, he realized he didn't want her to leave. He didn't trust her. Not yet. But the walls inside him had begun to shift, the smallest crack forming, just wide enough for one truth to slip in. She wasn't just passing through. She was meant to be here. And something had brought her for a reason. The snow had barely begun to melt in the town of Cinder Creek when the stranger arrived. He rode in on a chestnut gelding, clean boots and sharper eyes, asking quiet questions in quieter places. The general store, the livery, the saloon. His voice was calm, too calm, and every word seemed to weigh twice what it should. Woman. Late 20s. Brown hair. Wounded shoulder. "You seen her?" The barkeep didn't answer. Neither did the stable boy. But eyes watched him, and word traveled faster than the spring thaw. Margot heard it from Emma's father. She was in the barn, brushing the same mare Colt had taught her to saddle, when he came riding fast down the hill, face pale. His words tumbled over one another, but three caught in her ears like a gunshot. "He's looking for you." Her hands trembled. She knew that voice, that calm tone. Lieutenant Gaines. A man with polished buttons and blood under his fingernails. He had once handled communications for the Western Regiment, and rumors long whispered that he sold more than reports. Margot had seen too much. And he knew it. By the time Colt returned from checking fence lines, Margot was packed and standing at the door. He dismounted slowly, eyes narrowing. "You're leaving," he said flatly. She didn't deny it. "He's here. He found me." Colt said nothing. Only his jaw ticked. Once. "I can't bring this to your door," she continued, voice cracking. "You've lost enough." Colt stepped forward, stopped just a foot away. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected, but not soft. "You trusted Asher. Now trust me." Margot's shoulders slumped, as if the fight drained out with that one sentence. She didn't cry. She just nodded, once, and put down her bag. The next morning, Colt saddled 2 horses. They rode east, avoiding the main roads, cutting through pine and ravine until they reached a small cabin tucked into a bluff above Redwater Canyon. An old man answered the door, spectacles slipping down his nose. He squinted at Colt, then broke into a dry laugh. "Well, I'll be Colt Remington." "Need a favor, Davis," Colt said. "You still know how to read a dead man's secrets?" The man was Davis Keene, once a military attorney who had walked away from courtrooms after a scandal that nearly cost him his life. He owed Colt, and more importantly, he had nothing left to lose. Inside, by a warm stove, Davis examined the letter Margot carried, the one signed by Asher, sealed with a mark Colt recognized, a symbol they had invented as boys, used in their Army field notes. "This isn't forged," Davis confirmed after a long silence. "And the accusations inside? If half of this is true, someone's been burying bodies with paperwork." He looked at Margot. "You're a brave woman, Miss Ellis, and likely a hunted one." Meanwhile, Colt had sent word through a telegraph line he hadn't touched in years. A friend, former scout, now a bounty tracker, was asked to look into Gaines, find out who he worked for. where he had been since the war, what names followed in his wake. He didn't say it aloud, but Margot knew. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about justice, or vengeance, or maybe just truth, whatever was left of it. When they rode home, the air between them was different, not lighter, but shared. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask for it. But when night fell, and he paused before heading to bed, she met his eyes in the hallway and said only, "You didn't have to believe me." Colt's gaze was steady. "I didn't," he said, "but I believe Asher did." That was enough. For now, it took Davis Keene nearly a full day to unlock the last pieces of the sealed envelope. There were layers to it, codes within codes, a cipher buried in the margins, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Davis had seen military encryption in his time, but this was personal. When he unfolded the final page and laid it flat on the table, his face went pale. "There are names in here," he said quietly. "And not the kind whispered in saloons." Colt stood still by the window, arms crossed, eyes locked on the snow melting outside. Davis cleared his throat and read, "Captain Elias Morse, Major Heath Harlan, Lieutenant Silas Gaines." Each name was written in Asher Remington's precise hand. But it wasn't just a list of suspicions. The letter detailed incidents, falsified orders, redirected supply routes, sudden ambushes that made no sense on the surface, but aligned with the traitor's supposed movements. And at the end of the page, a signature. Brigadier General L. T. McHenry. Stamped and dated 2 weeks before Asher's death. "This letter should have gone straight to tribunal," Davis muttered. "Instead, it vanished. And so did the man who wrote it." He turned the last page over, and there it was. A cipher key. 6 digits, and a symbol that meant nothing to most. But Colt stepped forward slowly, hands shaking. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an old, worn field book with frayed corners. Inside was a page from long ago, scribbled by 2 brothers during the war. Colt traced the symbol. It matched. "It's mine," he whispered. "Asher used our childhood cipher. I taught it to him when he couldn't even read yet." His voice cracked. He turned away, knuckles pressed against his mouth. Margot stood quietly behind him. Then, without hesitation, she walked over and placed a hand over his. Colt didn't move. But he didn't pull away either. "He tried to save everyone," he said, voice raw. "And they silenced him." Margot squeezed his hand. They didn't look at each other, but for the first time since that stormy night she knocked on his door, they stood as something more than strangers. They were comrades, bound not by past pain, but by the same fight. "What are you going to do?" Davis asked. Colt turned, the soldier in him returning piece by piece. "We get this to someone who'll listen," he said. "We take this to Fort Banner. It's the nearest federal post that still holds court authority." Davis raised a brow. "And you think they'll just welcome you in with open arms?" Colt's mouth curved into something half between a smirk and a grimace. "No," he said. "But I've still got my badge, and a debt owed from the man in charge there." He looked at Margot. "You in?" Margot met his gaze without hesitation. "Asher died trying to bring this to light. I won't run from it again." It was settled. That night, Colt packed his rifle, the field book, and the letter into a leather satchel he hadn't touched since he left the military. He oiled his saddle, checked Margot's horse himself, and nailed shut the trapdoor leading to the root cellar, a childhood habit before long rides. Margot found him later that night, standing outside under a sky scattered with stars. "You ever scared?" she asked quietly. Colt took a long breath. "Every damn day since I lost him." She didn't ask who him meant. She already knew. Then she whispered, "I'm scared too." He looked at her. "Then we ride scared. But we ride." Colt steps fully out of the shadows, not just for justice, but for the woman who carried truth through storms, and for the brother who had never stopped fighting, even after death. They never made it into Fort Banner. At least, not the easy way. The narrow mountain road curved around the red clay hills just before the main gates of the federal post. The snow had mostly melted here, but the mud was thick and the wind sharp. Colt's instincts flared before he even saw the glint of metal. "Down!" he barked, pulling Margot off her saddle just as the crack of a rifle echoed through the pass. Bullets ripped through the brush behind them. Margot hit the ground, gasping, her fingers flying to the inside of her coat. Colt had already rolled to cover behind a boulder, blood darkening the side of his shirt. From the ridge above, 3 riders appeared. The man in the middle wore a gray coat, high boots, and a sneer that hadn't changed in years. Gaines. "Well, well, Remington," he called, voice echoing off the stone. "Still playing the hero? Thought you would have learned your lesson by now." Colt winced as he pressed a hand to his side. Not deep, not fatal, but it would slow him. "You always were a coward, Gaines," Colt growled. "Too afraid to face truth unless it was already dead." Gaines smiled coldly. "Truth is whatever survives the shot." He raised his hand, and the 2 men beside him aimed their rifles. Before Colt could move, a shot cracked from the rocks behind him. One of Gaines's men fell. Colt turned. Margot stood with legs braced, both hands gripping a small, polished revolver, the one she'd never admitted she carried. Her hands shook after the shot, but her aim had been perfect. "Get to the ridge!" Colt shouted, pushing to his feet. Together, they scrambled up the incline, exchanging fire with Gaines and his last remaining man. Colt's arm throbbed, but he moved with purpose, every step fueled by fury and clarity. When they reached the top, the gunfire ceased. Gaines was cornered, bleeding from his shoulder, panting. "You don't understand what this will bring," he spat, eyes wild. "That letter, it'll bring down more than just me." Colt approached, rifle lowered but ready. His voice was steady. "Then let it." A whistle sounded from the road below. A federal patrol, led by Davis Keene, riding hard with 4 armed men. Colt didn't look back. He handed Davis the satchel. "It's all in there. Letters, codes, signatures, everything you need." Davis nodded, his eyes scanning Gaines. "Let's see how brave you are in a courtroom." Within an hour, Gaines was shackled and loaded onto a wagon bound for military trial. The storm was over. Colt sat on the tailgate of the wagon, his shirt stained, his breathing heavy. Margot approached, wrapping his coat tighter around his shoulders. "You should lie down," she said softly. "I will," he replied. "Just needed to watch the sun set from here." Below them, the valley was bathed in gold and red. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys in the distance. He looked at her then, really looked. "You saved me back there." She half smiled. "We saved each other." He nodded slowly. "Asher, he chose right. He trusted you." Margot reached into her coat and pulled out the last piece of folded paper. Not a letter this time, but a drawing. A sketch of 2 brothers, smiling, one older, one younger, in uniforms. "He talked about you more than you know," she whispered, "even when it hurt." Colt took the drawing gently, eyes burning. Then he leaned his head back and whispered into the wind, "We did it, Ash. Justice is served. The traitor is unmasked." Colt and Margot, once strangers, now stand side by side, survivors of storms past and present. The truth has a name. And so does healing. Spring in the high plains came slow, but certain. Snow melted into dark earth, Wildflowers clawed through the thawing soil. Birds returned to the pines, and so did the laughter of children. Margot stood on the porch of the old barn, now repurposed with long tables, chalk slates, and shelves of well-worn books. Her voice rang clear as she pointed to letters on the board. "All right, little wranglers. C is for courage. T is for trust." Outside, horses snorted softly. Inside, 8 children repeated after her, some barefoot, some wide-eyed, all safe. A few yards away, Colt leaned on a post, watching. The ranch had changed too. Once quiet and brooding, it now welcomed travelers, old soldiers, ranch hands between jobs, wayfarers with tired feet. Colt gave them food, a roof, and, if needed, a place to rest their hearts. Just like Asher would have done. Later that evening, the fire crackled low. Margot leaned beside Colt on the steps of the porch. The stars blinked above, and the night was warm enough to sit without coats. They had not spoken much that day, not because there was nothing to say, but because some silences were full. Colt handed her a mug of tea. She took it, then said quietly, "He brought me to you, you know." He turned his head. Margot continued, eyes on the sky. "Asher, I thought I was running from something, but really, I was running toward you." Colt didn't answer right away. Then he reached behind him and pulled out a small wooden frame. Inside it, the letter from Asher, creased, stained, but now preserved behind glass. "I couldn't bury him," Colt said. "Not really. But this helps." He stood, walked inside, and hung the frame on the wall near the window, where dawn light would hit it each morning. When he turned back, Margot was watching him, tears bright in her eyes. "I never thought I'd stay anywhere again," she whispered. "And I never thought I'd let anyone in," Colt replied. He crossed the floor to her. "But here we are." He touched her face gently, his hand rough and warm. "I used to think love was something you had once and lost forever." Her breath caught. "And now?" she asked. "Now I know it can knock twice." He kissed her then, slow, certain, like opening a long-locked door. Mornings on the ranch began the same way after that. At sunrise, before the first rooster crowed, Margot would knock softly on the kitchen door. "Breakfast's ready, Colonel." Colt would grin from the bed, tug on his boots, and call back, "Never liked that title, but for you, I'll wear it." The old lantern still hung above the porch. It was never blown out, not because the night was dark, but because light had become their habit. One knock had once saved a life. Now, it began every day of the life they built together. If that story stirred something in you, if you felt the rain on that roof, or heard the quiet knock that changed everything, then you're already part of Wild West love stories. Out here, we believe the frontier wasn't just built by grit and guns, but by second chances, by quiet bravery, and by love that shows up when you least expect it. So if you want more tales of broken hearts mending, of old wounds healing, of lanterns lit in the darkest nights, hit that hype button, subscribe to the channel, and saddle up with us for the next story. Until then, keep the light on. Someone just might be knocking.